It's my pleasure to introduce to you today Matthew Bakkom, who's today's speaker. Matthew has earned his MFA from the University of Minnesota. His work has been widely recognized through grants and awards from prestigious organizations including the Knight Foundation, the Bush Foundation, the Jerome Foundation, the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council. He's had exhibits extensively in the United States and in Europe. He works frequently in Paris and in the Netherlands. He's had reviews, features of his work appear in our forum, the New York Times, the Paris Review, Time Out New York, New York Examiner, Flash Art, and also appeared a half dozen times on radio and television. We share an interest in the curatorial, and I'm very much looking forward to his talk today.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming out to the faculty colloquium. Thanks for the introduction, Lord Beth. It's a special opportunity in a moment like this to talk about projects that I might not have been able to present in the past. So today we'll be going through things that I've done very recently. I'm following in the huge footsteps of Linda Berry last week, who gave a very kind of broad-ranging personal talk. And this is going to be specific to two very recent projects. One of which was completed in the summer of 2012, and we're going to walk through the dynamics of that. And the other of which is actually still in progress in a lot of ways. And I thought it would be fun to share some of the ideas that motivate the process of production with you all. As Lori Beth mentioned, I got my MFA at the University of Minnesota. I'm also from Minneapolis, born and raised there. The image you're looking at now, some of you who are familiar with the Twin Cities might recognize as the Minneapolis Institute of Arts. And it is the location in which this first project, Fair Oaks, was both inspired by and produced for. Over the course of the last 10 years or so, I've kind of established a little spot in the world of the creative interpretation of archives. Working in places like New York City with the municipal archives there, where I collected and basically discovered correspondence to the mayor of the city of New York, letters of complaint that became a book eventually called the New York City Museum of Complaint. In Paris, I worked with the Bibliothèque Musée des Decorative Arts, which is part of the Louvre complex, and worked with a collection there that was a kind of an encyclopedic picture collection, and created a reading of that. And in both of these cases, the work was a specific relation to sight, a reaction to sight, an attempt to kind of discover what might be an appropriate gesture for myself as an artist to undertake, or a series of gestures that could manifest in a piece that allowed things from the inside to be manifest on the outside. In the case of the letters to the mayor, it was taking them from these kind of dark and dusty vaults and offering them first as a newsprint edition and then as a kind of fine art book, multiple, so to speak. And then in the case of the Massier, it was a very similar operation. Both of these two projects were also very much, in my mind, meant to be a contribution to the artistic culture and the public of these two cities, New York and Paris. Since that time, I've been kind of keen to kind of continue a series of work that would be specific to a city and somehow contribute to its cultural life. And in 2011, I decided that I would turn to my native city of Minneapolis and try to discover a project of the same nature. But after having spent enough time in archives and libraries, I decided to kind of change the direction of it a little bit and establish a new look and work in a different space in a lot of ways. In full disclosure, my artistic life has been tremendously influenced by this institution. It was probably the first museum that I ever attended as a child. And then later I worked as a media technician as well as a security guard at this museum. A note to all of the art students out there, being a museum security guard is a fantastic form of employment for any aspiring artist. It can be a little bit challenging in terms of some of the time on the feet and gallery interactions, but there's no way to get to know a collection better. So if you're looking for employment of that kind, do always look into the security staff of the museum. In the summer of 2011, in May actually, I had just recently gotten the news that the faculty here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison was welcoming me aboard. And I was in a particularly good mood. Perhaps the muses recognized that. And I decided that this would be a time to start the process of addressing not only this museum, but as you see in the foreground, this park. There's about a 4 square block park that's directly adjacent to the Minneapolis Institute of Arts. It's long been kind of one of the neglected parks in the Minneapolis park system's purview. There are a lot of parks in Minneapolis, City of Lakes after all. But this particular one, even though it is adjacent to the museum, was largely neglected. It does have a rather storied past, and up until 1922, the largest mansion in Minneapolis stood in this park. That's the Washburn Mansion, an early senator and one of the kind of original robber baron benefactors of the cultural scene in Minneapolis, but also one of the big money makers from the milling process that basically established the city. He built this 44-room mansion in the park in 1885. By 1915, he had died, and upon his death, he donated it to the park system. He donated the entire grounds, which had been landscaped originally by Frederick Olmsted, the same person who actually landscaped Central Park. And they received it into their care. In 1915, they were actually building the museum across the street. Another kind of esteemed architect, McKim and Reed, were in charge of that. But somewhere between 1913, 1915, and 1924, the park system decided that they could not maintain this building. So they demolished it. They took it apart piece by piece. Now, whether or not that was a kind of a populist reaction to this kind of display of wealth, or a simple reality that the park system understood, is still unknown to me. However, I can't be impressed, but think about the kind of almost auratic presence of this mansion in the center of this park that afterwards literally kind of descended into not exactly a no man's land by any means. It's quite a lovely park, but an expanse that is very strangely filled with park benches. For some reason, unbeknownst to myself and anyone else who I mentioned it to, there is no explanation for the 44 park benches which exist within this park. Correspondent to the number of rooms in the mansion, perhaps. These benches were put out in the late 1930s by the WPA, the Federal Works Progress Administration of the US government, kind of part of the relief efforts for the Depression. And I noticed one day how many benches there were in the park. And I proceeded to point that out to my friends at the museum and anybody I ran into. I said, have you guys ever noticed how many benches there are in this park? Now, part of what, I think one of the, not advantages per se, but one of the practices or one of the things that we cultivate as artists is a kind of sensitivity to details, and details of the everyday that may hold some kind of secret, may hold some kind of new way of looking at the world. And with this large number of benches in mind, I decided that perhaps we could do something with those. Now, I was further motivated by the fact that the benches themselves seemed to be in fairly poor shape. Over the course of time, they really hadn't been maintained. As I would discover later in the process, the boards of these benches hadn't been replaced since the early 1970s. And this park, overall, had been kind of let go of by the system. It was considered unpoliceable because, in part due to Frederick Olmsted's original landscaping, it has a fair amount of terrain, hills, and had a pond at one point. But it also, in the location that it exists in, became kind of a center of let's say, the other side of urban renewal. As different neighborhoods and then were kind of eliminated around this area because of the building of the freeways, of course, property values went down, and then the Mansion District, which this park had been the center of in the 1890s, became filled with basically halfway houses and low-rent apartments. This park became a place that had a reputation, and still to this day, has a reputation as a place where people who are on the skids, so to speak, perhaps homeless, perhaps in a kind of a recovery program of some kind, which there are a number of kind of centers for around the park, would spend time in, as naturally they would, as any other citizen of Minneapolis would too, and many other people do. But the reputation of the park was one of a kind of a bit of a kind of risky or questionable place. It's not terribly well lit, and it obviously hadn't been updated at any time. The park system itself had not been interested in maintaining the park per se. So with these pictures and with this realization in mind, and this is giving you a kind of a view, we'll be looking at a lot of pictures of these benches in the park over the next few minutes. I decided, well, what could I do that would make sense in terms of enlivening the park in some way, or turning it on? Drawing people's attention to this, what I had always considered a lovely park that was right next to the museum, but for whatever reason, whether it was political or sociological, is ignored by the museum, and also kind of neglected by the city. Having worked in the museum over the years, I do have many friends who are involved in both the curatorial and administrative side of things, and as is the case with a lot of my work, rather than being invited by curators per se, I made a suggestion to people I knew that there was a possibility we might do something. And that suggestion basically was that we would take each bench and create a specific relationship between it and a piece of work within the collection of the museum itself. Having spent many hours on the floors of this museum, I knew that collection, and it truly is a lovely one. If you haven't had the chance at Minneapolis to check it out, I do recommend dropping by. It's an encyclopedic museum, much like the Art Institute or the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So what you have there is a kind of collection that ranges the globe and has a number of specialties outside of European work, but there are great paintings there, and there are well-known sculptures. And I thought, well, how can we break this invisible barrier between the museum and the public space, the park space? Over the course of the last 15 or 20 years, my work has often been interested in kind of trying to create exchange between spaces, as I mentioned before, the inside and the outside, with these kind of documents per se, or images. In this case, I wanted to kind of create some kind of flow between these two spaces. So, using the power of Photoshop, I was able to take this concept of linking each bench to a piece inside the museum and illustrate it. These are the documents that I used in my proposal to the museum staff, specifically Michael Dust, who was in charge of a kind of innovative program at the time called EvoVel. I've known Michael for years, and I said, well, Michael, you know, maybe this could be something that plays into the museum's desire to communicate to the public in some way, and that would be also specific to the collection. So in this case, working with these kind of snapshots that I made in the park, I chose a piece in the museum, in this case, Poussin's Death of Germanicus, kind of very classic painting, and used Photoshop color sampling to identify the primary colors from within the painting itself, and then match them in some way to the boards of the bench. Very simplistic. Whether or not it really creates a connection is yet to be determined in a lot of ways. You guys are as much of a judge of that as anyone. But these were the ideas that I passed forward. And working with the Liechtenstein there, playing a little bit with the actual palette of the park, This is the early days. I got a lot better at color matching.